we need to talk about a critical development in the Nancy Guthrie case. But before we get into what this new forensic development means, we need to understand what investigators already know. Because there's been recent analysis of physical evidence from the crime scene that tells us exactly what happened the moment Nancy Guthrie was taken. And that analysis changes how we have to think about everything that's followed. If you're following this investigation, make sure you're subscribed to Apex Crime Analyst. We're tracking every verified development in this case, and when there's movement, you'll know about it here first. Let's start with what happened outside Nancy Guthrie's front door. The blood evidence found there has been analyzed by investigators with expertise in bloodstain pattern analysis. And what that analysis reveals is a very specific sequence of events. The blood spatter shows two distinct patterns. The first consists of medium velocity droplets, some of which contain what are called ring stains, hollow circular patterns that indicate the blood contained air bubbles when it struck the surface. That's significant because aspirated blood that's been coughed up, produces exactly that pattern. The size and distribution of those droplets, along with the presence of those ring stains, indicates that Nancy was positioned very close to the ground when this blood was expelled, likely within 12 inches. Her face was angled downward, almost perpendicular to the surface. That's consistent with someone either on their knees and hunched forward, or fully bent at the waist. It's not consistent with someone standing upright or lying flat. The second spatter pattern shows larger droplets with directional characteristics and what appears to be a smear where something, likely a foot or hand, contacted the blood after it had already been deposited. Taken together, these patterns tell us that Nancy was struck with enough force to cause bleeding, that she coughed up blood while positioned low to the ground, and that someone moved through that blood shortly after. Now, we've confirmed with sources that there is no blood evidence inside the home. That's important because it tells us where the altercation occurred. If Nancy had been attacked in her bedroom, as initial reports suggested based on her daughter's account, we would expect to see blood evidence along the route from the bedroom to the front door. We don't. What that suggests is that Nancy was mobile and under some form of control until she reached the front door area. That's where she resisted. That's where force was used. And based on the blood pattern, that's where she went down. After that, the blood trail stops. No additional spatter between the front door and wherever she was taken. The most likely explanation is that she was incapacitated by the strike to her face and then carried the rest of the way, possibly with her face positioned upward to prevent further blood drip. So we can reasonably reconstruct this. Nancy was awake, likely threatened with a weapon that gave the intruder control without immediate violence. She was moved through her home to the front door. At that threshold, she either refused to go further or physically resisted. She was struck in the face with enough force to cause immediate bleeding and aspiration. She went down, coughing blood, and then she was picked up and removed from the scene. That's not speculation. That's interpretation of physical evidence. The distinction matters. What we don't know is whether she was conscious when she was carried away. We don't know if the head trauma was severe enough to incapacitate her. We don't know what happened after she was removed from the property. The blood evidence gives us a snapshot of one moment in this event. It doesn't give us the full picture. But it does tell us something about the person responsible. Because the decision to strike an 84-year-old woman in the face rather than abandon the attempt speaks to motivation. This wasn't opportunistic. This wasn't someone who panicked and fled when resistance occurred. This was someone committed to removing Nancy from that home and willing to use force to accomplish it. The blood spatter analysis also tells us something else. Something that becomes important when we talk about DNA evidence. The specific pattern of droplets, the ring stains indicating aspirated blood, the positioning close to the ground, all of this indicates a violent physical altercation in a confined space. And violent physical altercations create opportunities for evidence transfer. Hair can be pulled or dislodged. Skin cells can be transferred through contact. Saliva containing DNA can be deposited on surfaces or clothing. What happened at that front door created conditions for DNA evidence. The question is whether investigators found it and whether they can use it. But before we get to that, we need to talk about what happened after Nancy was taken, because the behavioral evidence matters as much as the physical evidence. We know that at least 2 ransom notes were sent to local television stations, not to the family directly, to the media. That's unusual. In most kidnapping for ransom cases, communication goes through the family because publicity brings law enforcement involvement, and law enforcement involvement reduces the chance of a successful payoff. But in this case, the media was deliberately included from the beginning. That suggests either incompetence or a secondary motivation beyond money. The ransom notes included a Bitcoin wallet address, and we've confirmed that on February 10th, a transaction occurred in that wallet. Someone, presumably the Guthrie family or law enforcement, deposited a small amount of cryptocurrency along with a message, "We are ready to talk. Contact us." That's a standard negotiation tactic. Small payment as a show of good faith, coupled with a request for proof of life and further communication. The goal is to open dialogue, establish that the victim is alive, and create an opportunity for either a controlled exchange or investigative leads through continued contact. There was no response. The Bitcoin wallet showed no further activity. No withdrawal of the deposited funds, no additional messages, no proof of life, nothing. Now, there are a few ways to interpret that silence. The first is that the abductor became aware of law enforcement involvement and decided the risk of further communication outweighed the potential payoff. Bitcoin transactions, while pseudonymous, aren't completely untraceable. Someone with operational security concerns might have decided to abandon the ransom entirely rather than expose themselves through continued contact. The second interpretation is darker. If Nancy was injured during the abduction, and the blood evidence tells us she was, it's possible that injury proved more severe than initially apparent. It's possible she didn't survive long enough for a ransom exchange to occur. And if the person responsible realized they no longer had leverage, continuing the ransom charade would only increase their exposure without any potential benefit. The timing is worth noting. The Bitcoin contact attempt happened on February 10th. We don't know exactly when Nancy was abducted, but it's been more than 2 months since the case became public. If she was alive on February 10th and a genuine opportunity for exchange was being offered, the silence that followed doesn't make sense unless something changed. Unless the leverage disappeared. This is where we have to be clear about what we're doing. We're not stating that Nancy Guthrie died on or around February 10th. We're identifying a pattern that's consistent with that possibility. Law enforcement hasn't confirmed her status. No remains have been recovered. But the behavioral evidence, the ransom attempt followed by complete silence, creates investigative questions that have to be considered. Analysts who've reviewed the available evidence believe this was most likely a single offender. The blood evidence shows one smear pattern. The video footage captures one individual. There's no indication of coordinated roles or multiple participants. The operational security failures, distinctive backpacks sold exclusively at Walmart, reflective stripes that increase visibility, a face mask that doesn't prevent DNA transfer. Those suggest someone working alone without experienced guidance. The choice to send ransom notes to media rather than family, the selection of an elderly victim who would physically resist, the apparent lack of a well-planned exit strategy, these aren't characteristics of sophisticated criminal operation. They're characteristics of someone who planned certain elements but failed to think through others. Someone who may have had a specific motivation tied to Nancy or her family, but who lacked the experience to execute a kidnapping successfully. That profile matters for the DNA investigation because it affects probability. If we're dealing with someone who had prior contact with Nancy, a service worker, a delivery person, someone in her social or commercial orbit, then finding their DNA in her home becomes less surprising. It doesn't exclude them from suspicion, but it complicates the interpretation. Which brings us back to the hair evidence. According to sources close to the investigation, DNA evidence from Nancy Guthrie's home, specifically hair samples found inside the residence, has been transferred to the FBI's laboratory for what's being described as advanced analysis. Now, the Pima County Sheriff's Department has acknowledged this, but their statement is carefully worded. They say the FBI has been involved since the beginning of the investigation, that this collaboration isn't new, and that their private lab in Florida continues to share information with the FBI and other partner labs across the country. They confirm that DNA analysis remains ongoing. That's the official position. But let's examine what that actually tells us. Because when you strip away the public relations language, what you're looking at is a decision to escalate evidence from one laboratory to another. And in forensic investigations, that escalation happens for specific reasons. The first thing we need to understand is what type of hair evidence we're likely dealing with. And this matters more than you might think. Hair evidence breaks down into two categories: hair with the root attached and hair without it, what forensic scientists call rootless hair or hair shaft samples. If investigators had found hair with roots attached, the DNA extraction process would be relatively straightforward. The root contains nuclear DNA, the kind that gives you a full genetic profile suitable for database comparison. A private lab with standard capabilities could process that. If they'd had rooted hair from an unknown individual, we'd likely already know the results. The fact that this evidence is being sent to the FBI months into the investigation suggests we're dealing with something more complex. Rootless hair is different. For most of modern forensic history, hair without the root was considered limited in its investigative value. You could examine it microscopically, look at color, texture, diameter, but you couldn't extract the kind of DNA that would identify an individual. The only genetic material available was mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited maternally and shared by potentially thousands of people. It can exclude suspects, but it can't definitively identify them. That changed within the last few years. Scientists at UC Santa Cruz and private companies like Othram Forensics developed techniques to extract what are called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, from rootless hair shafts. These are genetic markers distributed across the entire genome, and when you collect enough of them, you can build a profile suitable for genetic genealogy. This is the same technique that's been used to solve cold cases like the Golden State Killer and, more recently, to identify Rex Heuermann in the Gilgo Beach murders. The FBI doesn't perform SNP extraction from rootless hair in-house. What they do is coordinate with specialized labs that have that capability. So when evidence goes to the FBI in a case like this, it often means it's being evaluated for referral to one of those specialized contractors. That process involves determining whether the hair sample is suitable for advanced analysis, whether it's been sufficiently preserved, and whether the potential investigative value justifies the cost, which can run into tens of thousands of dollars per sample. Now, here's where this gets interesting. We've also learned that investigators have been dealing with mixed DNA samples from the scene. Mixed DNA means genetic material from more than one person in a single sample. That could be from something like a door handle that multiple people touched, or fabric that came into contact with more than one individual. Separating mixed DNA is technically complex. It requires probabilistic software, careful analysis, and often multiple rounds of testing. It's time-consuming, and it doesn't always yield a usable profile. But hair evidence is different. A single hair, even without the root, represents a single source sample. Yes, there can be surface contamination, touch DNA from someone who handled it, environmental exposure, but labs have protocols to clean that away. The DNA inside the hair shaft belongs to one person. So what we're likely looking at here is two parallel investigative tracks. One focused on separating and analyzing mixed DNA from other evidence, and another focused on extracting a single source profile from a hair. That creates a strategic question. If the mixed DNA is proving difficult, does the hair represent a faster pathway to identification? And if so, whose hair is it? This is the problem that every investigator working this case has to confront. Nancy Guthrie lived in that home. Family members visited, friends, service workers, delivery personnel, any number of people could have legitimately been inside that residence. Finding hair in someone's home doesn't automatically mean it belongs to the person responsible for their disappearance. The critical variables are: where was the hair found, what are its physical characteristics, and does it match anyone who should have been there? We don't have answers to those questions yet. What we do know is that investigators felt this evidence was significant enough to elevate it to federal analysis. That suggests something about the hair's context or characteristics made it worth pursuing. Maybe it was found in a location inconsistent with casual visitation. Maybe its color, length, or texture doesn't match Nancy or known visitors. Maybe there were multiple hairs from the same unknown source. We're working with incomplete information, but the decision itself tells us something. And here's where the blood evidence connects back to the hair evidence. Remember that violent altercation at the front door? The one where Nancy was struck hard enough to cause facial bleeding and aspiration? That kind of physical struggle creates opportunities for hair transfer. If someone grabbed Nancy, if there was a struggle, if she was lifted and carried, hair could have been pulled loose. Not Nancy's hair, the perpetrator's hair. Think about the mechanics of what the blood spatter analysis told us. Nancy was hunched low to the ground, coughing blood. Then the blood trail stops, and there's a smear pattern suggesting movement through the existing blood. The most logical explanation is that someone picked her up at that point. And when you're lifting an adult person who may be resisting or incapacitated, there's close physical contact. Hair can transfer during that contact. So the question isn't just whether hair was found in Nancy's home. The question is whether hair was found in a location consistent with the abduction sequence we can reconstruct from the blood evidence. Was it near the front door? Was it on the walkway? Was it in a position that suggests it was deposited during the struggle we know occurred? We don't have that information. But the fact that investigators are pursuing advanced analysis suggests they believe the hair has investigative value beyond routine elimination. Now let's talk about the technology and timeline, because this is where expectations need to be managed. SNP extraction from rootless hair is not a fast process. The DNA in hair shafts is degraded compared to what you'd find in blood or saliva. It exists in much smaller quantities. The extraction process is delicate, the amplification is complex, and success isn't guaranteed on the first attempt. Labs working with rootless hair sometimes need to make multiple extraction attempts from different sections of the hair shaft before they get a usable profile. Once you have a profile, it needs to be uploaded to genetic genealogy databases. But here's a complication. The three largest consumer DNA databases, Ancestry, 23andMe, and MyHeritage, don't allow law enforcement uploads. Genealogists working these cases are limited to three smaller databases: GED Match and Family Tree DNA, and DNA Justice Foundation. The pool of potential matches is smaller. The likelihood of finding close relatives decreases. If you do get matches, you're typically looking at second, third, or fourth cousins, people who share a common ancestor several generations back. Building a family tree from those distant relationships to identify the specific individual who left the DNA is labor-intensive. It can take weeks or months of genealogical research, documentary verification, and investigative cross-referencing. And that's if everything goes well. If the SNP extraction succeeds, if there are matches in the available databases, if those matches have built out their family trees, if the genealogical research can be completed without hitting brick walls. So when we talk about hair evidence being sent to the FBI, we're talking about a process that, in realistic terms, could take anywhere from 3 months to over a year before it yields an investigative lead. This isn't television forensics. This is meticulous scientific work with uncertain timelines and no guaranteed outcome. But it does work. We've seen it solve cases that were cold for decades. We've seen it identify suspects who had no prior criminal record, who weren't in any database, who believed they'd successfully avoided detection. The genealogical approach has fundamentally changed what's possible in forensic investigation. The question is whether it will work here. Because there's another scenario we have to consider. What if the hair belongs to Nancy herself? What if it's from a family member who visited regularly? What if it's from someone who had legitimate access to the home and no connection to the abduction? Investigators would screen for those possibilities before committing to expensive advanced analysis. They'd compare physical characteristics, color, length, texture, against known samples. They'd evaluate the hair's location and context. But they can't know for certain whose DNA they'll find until the analysis is complete. And if months of work leads back to an explained source, the investigation is back to the mixed DNA samples and whatever other evidence they've collected. This is the reality of complex forensic investigations. Progress isn't linear. Leads develop and collapse. Promising evidence sometimes yields nothing actionable. And the gap between what the public knows and what investigators are working on can be vast. So where does that leave us? We have blood evidence that reconstructs a violent struggle at Nancy Guthrie's front door. We have ransom behavior that started with media-focused demands and ended with unexplained silence after contact was offered. We have DNA evidence being pursued through multiple analytical pathways, at least one of which involves cutting-edge technology. And we have a timeline that's now stretching into months without public resolution. What we don't have is Nancy Guthrie. We don't have a suspect in custody. We don't have a location where she was taken. We don't have confirmation of whether she's alive. And we don't have a clear timeline for when any of those answers might emerge. The hair evidence represents potential. It represents a possible pathway to identification if the DNA is foreign, if the extraction succeeds, if genealogical analysis yields matches, if those matches lead to a suspect. That's a lot of conditional clauses. That's a lot of places where this investigative thread could stall or break. But it's also the best hope for a breakthrough in a case where other leads appear to have gone cold. The video footage captured a suspect, but identification hasn't followed. The ransom contact created an opportunity for communication. But that door closed. The crime scene evidence was collected, but months later we're still talking about ongoing analysis rather than results. So the hair evidence matters not because it guarantees resolution, but because it represents active investigative progress in a case that desperately needs it. And here's what we should be watching for in the coming months. If the FBI refers this evidence to a specialized lab like Othram, that suggests they believe SNP extraction is viable and worth the investment. If we start hearing about genetic genealogy being employed, that tells us they've successfully built a profile and they're in the identification phase. If there's a sudden request for public tips about a specific individual or vehicle, that could indicate they've narrowed to a suspect through genealogical research and they're building corroboration. But we should also be prepared for silence. Because if the hair analysis fails or if it points back to an explained source, investigators aren't going to announce that publicly. They're going to continue working other investigative angles without confirming what didn't work. That's the frustrating part of following these cases in real time. The information flow is controlled. The investigative strategy is opaque. And the gap between development and disclosure can be months or years. But the work continues whether we see it or not. One thing we can say with certainty, the person responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance made mistakes. The distinctive backpack, the face mask that allowed DNA transfer, the media-focused ransom strategy, the decision to use force at a location where blood evidence would be left behind, these are all investigative vulnerabilities. They're all potential pathways to identification. The question isn't whether those vulnerabilities exist. The question is whether investigators can exploit them before time, and degraded evidence make that impossible. And that brings us back to the connection between what we know and what's being tested. The blood spatter evidence tells us there was a violent physical confrontation. The ransom silence tells us something changed after initial contact was offered. The hair evidence tells us investigators believe they have a DNA sample worth pursuing with advanced technology. Those three pieces don't exist in isolation. They're part of the same event sequence. If the hair came from the person who struck Nancy at that front door, if SNP extraction succeeds, if genetic genealogy identifies that person, then the blood evidence becomes corroboration. The spatter pattern that places Nancy close to the ground, the smear that indicates someone moved through that blood, The lack of continued blood trail suggesting she was carried, all of that would support a reconstruction of events that could be presented in court. But that only works if the DNA analysis succeeds. And right now, that's the critical unknown. What we're going to do here at Apex Crime Analyst is continue tracking every verified development. We're going to monitor for any indication that the DNA analysis has progressed beyond the FBI referral stage. We're going to watch for changes in the public messaging from Pima County Sheriff's Department. We're going to look for signs that investigative focus is shifting, whether toward a suspect, a location, or a new evidence category. And when there's something concrete to report, you'll hear it here. Not speculation, not rumor. Verified developments that move our understanding of this investigation forward. If you want to stay on top of this case, make sure you're subscribed. We're not chasing engagement with this. We're tracking an active investigation where an elderly woman's fate is still unknown and someone responsible is still unidentified. That demands serious coverage, not sensationalism. The Nancy Guthrie case is entering a phase where forensic science is doing work that wasn't possible even 5 years ago. Blood spatter analysis is reconstructing events with precision. Rootless hair that would have been filed away as non-probative evidence is now being analyzed with techniques that can extract genetic profiles from microscopic DNA quantities. Mixed samples that would have been considered too complex are being separated with probabilistic software. Genetic genealogy is reaching across generations to identify suspects who never appeared in criminal databases. The technology exists, the expertise exists. The question is whether the evidence quality is sufficient and whether the investigative timeline allows for resolution while leads are still actionable. We're going to find out. But we need to be realistic about what that timeline looks like. We need to understand that silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. And we need to recognize that even with advanced forensics, some cases remain unresolved. Not because investigators aren't working them, but because evidence has limits and some questions don't have answers we can access. That's the truth of it. And in a case like Nancy Guthrie's, where a family is waiting for answers and a community wants resolution, the truth, even when it's uncertain, is what we owe. So we'll keep watching. We'll keep reporting. And when the forensic work that's happening now yields results, we'll be here to break it down, explain what it means, and show you where the investigation goes next. That's our commitment. That's what Apex Crime Analyst does. Stay with us on this, because when there's movement, you need to know about it. And when that movement happens, it's going to happen fast.